It's chapter 4. George had left the rapier room now and gone into the main office. I followed him, taking my tea with me, winding my way amongst the debris of our business, piles of old newspapers, bags of salt, neatly stacked chains, and boxes of silver seals. Sunlight streamed through the windows that looked out into the little yard, igniting dust particles in the air. On Lockwood's desk, between the mummified heart and the bottle of gobstoppers, sat our black leather case book, containing records of every job we'd undertaken. Soon we'd have to write up about the Wimbledon wraiths in there. George was standing by his desk, staring at it in a glum sort of way. My desktop gets messy fairly often, but this morning George's was something else. It was a scene of devastation. Burned matches, lavender candles, and pools of melted wax littered the surface. A chaos of tangled wires and naked elements spilled forth from a disemboweled electrical heater. In one corner, a blowtorch lay at its side. At the end of the desk, something else sat, hidden under a black satin cloth. Heat didn't work, I take it? I said. No, George said. Hopeless. Couldn't get it hot enough. I'm going to try putting it in daylight today. See if that spurs him on a bit. I regarded the shrouded object. You sure? It didn't do anything before. Wasn't so bright then. I'll take it out into the garden when the noonday sun comes around. I tapped my fingers on the desk. Something I'd been meaning to say for a while, something that had been on my mind, finally came out. You know that sunlight hurts it, I said slowly. You know it burns the plasm? George nodded. Yep, obviously. That's the idea. Yeah, but that's hardly going to get it to talk, is it? I mean, do you think that'll be counterproductive? All your methods seem to involve inflicting pain. So what? It's a visitor. Anyway, do visitors actually feel pain? George pulled the cloth away, revealing the glass jar, cylindrical and slightly larger than the average wastebasket. It was sealed at the top with a complex plastic stopper, from which a number of knobs and fangs produced. George bent close to the jar and flipped a lever, revealing a small rectangular grill within the plastic. He spoke into the grill. Hello in there. Lucy thinks you feel discomfort. I disagree. Care to tell us who's right? He waited. The substance in the jar was dark and still. Something sat motionless in the center of the murk. It's daytime, I said. Of course it won't answer. George flicked the lever back. It's not answering out of spite. It's got a wicked nature. You said as much yourself after it spoke to you. Well, we don't really know, to be honest, I said, at the shadow behind the glass. We don't know anything about it. Well, we know it told you that we're all going to die. It said, death is coming, George. It's not quite the same thing. It's hardly a term of endearment. George heaved the tangle of electrical equipment off his desk and dumped it in the box beside his chair. No, it's hostile to us, Luce. Mustn't go soft on it now. I'm not going soft. I just think torturing it isn't necessarily the way forward. We might need to focus more on its connection with me. George gave a non-committal grunt. Yes, your mysterious connection. We stood surveying the jar. In ordinary sunlight, like today's, the glass looked thick and slightly bluish. Under moonlight, or artificial illumination, it glinted with a silvery tinge, for this was silver glass, a ghost-proof material manufactured by the Sunrise Corporation. And sure enough, within the glass prison was a ghost. The identity of this spirit was unknown. All that we could be certain of was that it belonged to a human, a skull now bolted to the base of the jar. The skull was yellowish-brown and battered, but otherwise unexceptional. It was adult size, but whether a man's or a woman's we could not tell. The ghost being tethered to the skull was trapped inside the ghost jar. Most of the time it manifested as a murky, greenish plasm and drifted consolatingly behind the glass. Occasionally, and unusually, or usually, at inconvenient times, such as when you were going past with a hot drink or a full bladder, it congealed violently into grotesque, transparent faces with bulbous nose, goggling eyes, and rubbery mouth of excessive size. This shocking visage would then leer and gape at whoever was in the room. Allegedly, George had seen it blow kisses. Often it seemed to be trying to speak, and it was this apparent ability to communicate that was the central to our mystery, and why George kept it on his desk. Visitors, as a rule, don't talk, at least, not in a very meaningful way. Most of them, the shades and lurkers, the cold maidens, the stalkers, and the other type ones, are practically silent, except for a limited repertoire of moans and sighs. Type 2s are more powerful, more dangerous, and sometimes can deliver a few half-intelligible words that listeners, like me, are able to pick up. These too are often repetitious imprints on the air that seldom alter, and are often connected to the key emotion that binds the spirit to the earth: terror, anger, or a desire for vengeance. What ghosts don't do, as a rule, is talk properly, except for the legendary Type 3s. Long ago, Marissa Fitz, one of the first two psychical investigators in Britain, claimed to have encountered a certain spirit with which she had full conversations. She mentioned this in several books and implied, she was never really forthcoming about the details, that they had told her certain secrets about death, about the soul, about its passage into the place beyond. After her own demise, others had tried to achieve similar results. A few even claimed to have done so, but their accounts were never verified. It became a point of faith among those agents that Type 3s existed, but that they remained almost impossible to find. That's certainly what I'd believed. Then the spirit in the jar, the selfsame one with the horrid goggly face, had talked to me. I had been alone in the basement at the time. I'd knocked over the ghost jar, twisting one of the levers out of its stopper, so that the hidden grill was exposed, and all at once I heard the ghost's voice talking in my head, really talking, I mean, addressing me by name. It told me things too, vague, unpleasant things about the deaths coming variety, until I turned the lever and shut it up, which may have been a mistake, because it had never spoken again. Lockwood and George, when I told them about my encounter, had reacted at first with vast excitement. They raced to the basement, took out the jar, and swung the lever. The face in the jar said nothing. We tried a series of experiments, turning the lever, differing degrees, trying at different times of day, sitting expectantly beside the jar, even hiding out of sight. Still, the ghost was silent. Occasionally it materialized as before and glared at us in a resentful, uh, truculent manner, but it never spoke or seemed inclined to do so. It was a disappointment to us all, for several reasons. Lockwood was acutely aware of the prestige of our agency would gain from the event, if it could be proved. George thought of the fascinating insights that that we might be able to gain from somebody speaking from beyond the grave. To me, it was more personal, a sudden revelation of the terrifying potential of my talent. It frightened me and filled me with foreboding, and there was a part of me that was relieved when it didn't happen again. But I was annoyed. Just that one fleeting incident, and both Lockwood and George had looked at me with a new respect. If it could be repeated, if it could be confirmed for all to see, I would, in one fell swoop, be the most celebrated operative in London. But the ghost remained stubbornly silent, and as the months passed, I almost began to doubt that anything significant had occurred at all. Lockwood, in his practical fashion, had finally turned his attention to other things, although, in every sense now, he made sure to double check what voices, if any, I could hear. But George had persisted with his investigations into the skull, attempting ever more fanciful methods to get the ghost to respond. Failure didn't discourage him. If anything, it had increased his passion. I could see his eyes gleaming now behind his glasses as he studied the silent jar. Clearly it's aware of us, he mused. In some way, it's definitely conscious of what's going on around it. It knew your name. It knew mine too, you told me. It must be able to hear things through the glass. Or lip read, I pointed out. We do quite often have it uncovered. I suppose. He shook his head. Who knows? So many questions. Why is it here? What does it want? Why talk to you? I've had it for years. It's never tried to talk to me. Well, there wouldn't be much point, would there? You don't have that talent. I tapped the glass with a fingernail. How long have you actually had this jar, George? You stole it, didn't you? I forget how. George sat back heavily in his chair, making the wood creak. It was back when I was a Fitz agent, before I got kicked out for insubordination. I was working at Fitz House on the Strand. You ever been in there? Only for an interview. Didn't last long. Well, it's a vast place, George said. You've got the famous public rooms where people come for help. All those glass booths with receptionists taking down their details. And then there's the conference halls where they display all their famous relics, and the mahogany boardroom overlooking the Thames. But there's a lot of secret stuff too, which most of the agents can't access. The Black Library, for instance, where Marissa's original collection of books is kept under lock and key. I always wanted to browse in there, but the bit that really interested me was the underground. There are basements that go deep down, and some of them stretch back out under the Thames, they say. I used to see supervisors going down there in special service lifts. Sometimes I'd see the jars like this one being wheeled into lifts on trolleys. I'd often ask what all this was about. Safe storage, they said. There were vaults where they kept dangerous visitors safe until they could be incarcerated, or rather incinerated, in furnaces on the lower level. Furnaces? I asked. The Fitz furnaces are over in Clerkenwell, aren't they? Everyone uses them. Why'd they need more underground? I wondered that, George said. I wonder about a lot of things. It used to annoy me that I got no answers. Anyway, in the end, I asked so many questions that they fired me. My supervisor, a woman named Sweeney, face like an old sock soaked in vinegar, gave me an hour to clear my desk. And as I was standing there, gathering a few things up in my cardboard box, I saw a trolley with 2 or 3 jars being pushed towards the lift. The porter got called away, so what did I do? Only slipped over and nicked the nearest jar. I put it in my box, hid it under my old jumper, and carried it out, right under Sweeney's nose. He grinned in triumph at the memory. And that's why we've got our very own haunted skull. Who'd have thought it'd be turning out to be a genuine Type 3? If it actually is one, I said doubtfully. It hasn't done anything for ages. Don't worry, we'll find a way to get it to speak again. George was polishing his glasses on his t-shirt. We've got to. The stakes are so high, Luce. 50 years since the problem began. We've hardly scratched the surface. Understanding ghosts. They're all mysteries around us, everywhere we look. I nodded absently, riveted as George was, but my mind had flitted elsewhere. I was staring at Lockwood's empty desk. One of his jackets hung over the back of an old, cracked chair. Speaking of a mystery slightly closer to home, I said, do you ever wonder about Lockwood's door upstairs, that one on the landing? George shrugged. Nope. You must do. He blew out his cheeks. Of course I wonder, but it's his business, not ours. I mean, what can be in there? He's just so touchy about it. I asked him about it last week, and he nearly snapped my head off again. Which probably tells us that it's best to forget all about it, George says. This isn't our house, and if Lockwood wants to keep something private, then that's entirely up to him. I'd drop it if I were you. I just think it's a pity that he's so secretive, I said simply. It's a shame. George gave a skeptical snort. Oh, come on. You love all that mystery about him. Just like you love that pensive, far-off look he has sometimes, as he's brooding about important matters or contemplating a tricky bowel movement. Don't try to deny it. I know. I looked at him. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing. All I'm saying, I said, is that it's not right. The way he keeps everything to himself. I mean, we're his friends, aren't we? He should open up to us. It makes me think that. Think what, Luce? I spun round. Lockwood was at the door. He'd showered and dressed, and his hair was wet. His dark eyes were on me, and I couldn't tell how long he'd been there. I didn't say anything, but I felt my face go pink. George busied himself with something on his desk. Lockwood held my gaze a moment, then broke the connection, and he held up a rectangular object. I came down to show you this, he said. It's an invitation. He skimmed the object across the room. It flipped past George's outstretched hand and skidded along his desk, and came to a halt in front of me. It was a piece of card, stiff, silver grey, glittery. Its top was emblazoned with an image of a rearing unicorn holding a lantern in its forehoof. Beneath the logo it said, "The Fitz Agency. Ms. Penelope Fitz and the board of esteemed Fitz agents invite Anthony Lockwood, Lucy Carlyle, and George Cubbins to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the company founding at Fitz House, the Strand, on Saturday the 19th of June at 8 p.m. Black tie, carriages at 1 a.m. RSVP." I stared at it blankly, my embarrassment forgotten. Penelope Fitz inviting us to a party? And not just any party, Lockwood said. The party. The party of the year. Anyone who's anybody is going to be there. Uh, so why have we asked to be there then? George gazed over my shoulder at the card. Lockwood spoke in a slightly huffy voice. Because we're a very prominent agency. Also because Penelope Fitz is personally friendly to us. You remember, we discovered that body of her childhood friend at Combe Hall, at the bottom of the screaming staircase. What was her name? Or his name? Sam something. She's grateful. She wrote telling us so. And maybe she's kept an eye on our more recent successes too. I raised my eyebrows at this. Penelope Fitz, chairman of the Fitz Agency and granddaughter of the great psychical pioneer Marissa Fitz, was one of the most powerful people in the country. She had government ministers queuing at her door. Her opinions on the problem were published in all the newspapers and discussed in all the living rooms in the land. She seldom left her apartments above Fitz House and was said to control her business from within with an iron fist. I rather doubted that she was overtly interested in Lockwood Co., fascinating though we are. All the same, here was the invitation. 19th of June, I mused. That's this Saturday. So, are we going? George asked. Of course we are, Lockwood said. This is a perfect opportunity to make some connections. All the big names will be there. All the agency heads, the big cheeses of Deeprack, the industrialists who run the salt and iron companies, maybe even the chairman of the Sunrise Corporation. We'll never get another chance to meet them. Lovely, said George. An evening spent in a crowded, sweaty room with dozens of fat, old, boring business people. What could be better? Give me a choice between that and fighting off a pale stench. I'd go for the flatulent ghost any time. You lack vision, George, Lockwood said disapprovingly. And you also spend far too much time with that thing. He reached out and, just as I had done, tapped his nail on the thick glass of the ghost jar. It made a faint, discordant sound. The substance in the jar stirred briefly, then hung still. This isn't healthy, and you're getting nowhere with it anyway. George frowned. I don't agree. There's nothing more important than this. With the correct research, we could have a breakthrough. Just think, if we could get the dead to speak to us on demand. The buzzer on the wall rang, signalling that someone had rung the bell upstairs. Lockwood made a face. Who can that be? No one's made an appointment. Perhaps it's the grocer's boy, George suggested. Our weekly fruit and veg. I shook my head. No, he delivers tomorrow. It'll be new clients. Lockwood picked up the invitation and tucked it safely into his pocket. What are we waiting for? Let's go and see. And that's the end of chapter 4.